housekeeping, and that'll give everybody a chance to sign on and catch up. So I see some familiar faces in the crowd, and I'm Denise Withers. I'm a communication strategist, and I've been working with Robin and her team for the last year or so to really help them shift the narrative on climate action leadership. And I'm going to be your host for today. So before we get going, just a couple of housekeeping items. All of you pretty much have noticed that this is not a webinar, it's a Zoom meeting. And we did that because we're hoping to be able to have some discussion with you in the second half of the session. And so what that means is it gives us room for more engagement, but it also gives us room for things to be a little more chaotic. So I'm going to ask you to keep yourselves on mute during Robin's presentation. And you may also want to turn your video camera off just to, lighten the cognitive load for everyone. If you have questions, we're going to have lots of time for questions at the end, so you can put them in the chat. And you can also raise your hand using the reaction tool. And I'm hoping everybody's kind of found out where that is. If you look down in near the bottom of your screen, you'll see a thing called reaction tool, and you can do thumbs up and you can raise your hand and things like that. So yeah, let's get going. We've got 73 people already. Holy moly, that's fantastic. So I wanted to introduce Dr. Robin Cox. She's the director of the Resilience by Design Lab and the Adaptation Learning Network. She's also a professor of disaster and emergency management at Royal Roads University. So Robin, hello.
Hi, thanks, Denise. Nice to be here.
Well, it's great. And you've got the sun shining on you, which is fantastic.
Might have to adjust that.
Oh, it looks nice. It looks nice. And then behind the scenes, we have a couple of other members of our team. We have the Adaptation Learning Network program manager, Vivian Forsman, and she's going to be helping out putting some links and things in the chat. And Vivian is a great source of info. So if you have questions about things as we're going along, you can also feel free to send her a direct message. And then our digital communications manager, Bridget Forsman, is also on the call, and I'm sure she'd be happy to help out as well. So I see that we've got lots and lots of our colleagues and supporters and network partners here, and I really want to welcome you and thank you for coming. We did just want to do a quick traditional land acknowledgement. I am really grateful to be coming to you from beautiful Qualicum Beach on Vancouver Island, and that's the traditional territory of the Coast Salish and Comox First Nations. And Robin, where are you?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I live and work here in Victoria, and what we call Victoria. I'm a settler, and I'm full of gratitude for being able to live here and acknowledge with deep respect and gratitude the Kosamson and Algonquin ancestors and families who have lived here for thousands of years and continue with their historical relationship with the land today. And this is also where Royal Roads sits as well. So I really appreciate, and as you said, the sun is shining, and it reminds me of how grateful I am to live on these unceded territories.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Robin. And so I'd love for you to drop a note in the chat where everybody's coming from. If you don't know your traditional territory, that's all right. Just be great to hear where you all are. We're up to 87 people now. Fantastic. So where is everybody? Cowichan Valley. Eric, hello, Eric. Newfoundland Squamish. London, UK. Hello. Oak Bay, Nanaimo. Sheffield, UK. Thanks for staying up late, everybody out there. Montreal, Castlegar, Salt Spring, Ottawa, PEI. Here we go. We're picking up now. Treaty 1 territory, Métis Land. I missed it. Oh, sorry. There we go. Canmore, Scotland. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have everybody here from around the world, it looks like. And I hope you're going to learn a lot today. And we're looking forward to hearing your feedback and thoughts about the framework. Vivian has been dropping the framework, the link to the framework in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I would encourage you to grab that link and download it. And you don't have to look at it right now, but there's tons and tons of stuff in there. So it'll give you a chance to, have a follow along a little bit as we go. Now, before we get going with the main presentation, I did just want to do a super quick poll because I wanted to get a sense of where everybody's at when we talk about competency frameworks and we talk about climate adaptation and things like that. So I've just got a little poll that I'm going to bring up here. And there's 2 questions. So I'm going to ask you to play along with that. And so the first question is, are you already familiar with the purpose and the content of the climate adaptation competency framework? And the second one is advancing climate change adaptation capacity part of your job right now? Just do a little Jeopardy. Do, 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 do. Fantastic. So, interesting. All right. So I'm going to end the poll. Last chance, last 5 seconds. Fantastic. All right. So, very interesting. Kind of split on. So a lot of you actually are familiar with the competency framework, which is fantastic. And you're in that climate change adaptation capacity space. So that's really great to hear. We're really glad that you're here. So thank you for indulging me in that. So we've got about a 25-minute presentation, which we're going to do kind of as a Q&A, where I'm gonna throw some nice easy questions at Robin, and she's going to tell us about the framework. And then we should have lots of time to open it up for discussion and questions. So as I said, if you have questions, if you want to either drop them in the chat, or if you want to hang on to them till the end, that would be terrific. So just give me a second to get myself sorted here. And I think you should still be seeing my slide. And there we go. Let's go. So, Robin, I think that most people on the call know what's at stake when we talk about climate change. But for those who don't, or who could use a refresher, could you take a minute to remind us why we need to invest in developing climate adaptation capacity?
Sure, thanks. I mean, as you say, I think most people recognize that we're in the midst of what most of us are saying is an existential crisis. And we put a lot of global attention, not enough, on mitigation, on reducing emissions, trying to slow climate change. But we know that there are already effects happening now, and that those will increase in the years to come. And the effects of those long-term shifts in global warming are going to cause a lot of suffering. They're already causing suffering and will ruin millions of lives and cost billions of dollars economically, with sea level rise, wildfire, smoke, extreme weather, etc. So we need to be focusing, not taking focus away from mitigation, but also focusing on adaptation to make those adjustments in our orientation, our thinking, our planning, our decisions, and our actions to address those impacts and try and reduce in whatever ways we can the risks and the harm and impacts, and potentially take advantage of new opportunities that arise. So I know from my work for many years in disaster management with a focus on resilience and disaster risk reduction, and that's really the foundation of the lab that I run, the Resilience by Design Lab, that developing our capacity for engaging with and enacting climate adaptation is going to be a critical part of our response to this crisis.
Yeah, excellent. And so how did you turn that insight into action?
Well, in some ways it was very fortuitous. I made some connections with the Climate Action Secretariat here in BC. And as part of that, we connected with the Natural Resources Canada BRACE project, building regional adaptation capacity and expertise. And we put in a proposal with the Climate Action Secretariat to help bridge this gap between where we're at and where we need to get around skills and knowledge. So the Adaptation Learning Network project has many parts, one of which is building a professional learning community. And from that, we knew that we wanted to create courses, not for credit training courses. And so we did a gap analysis and trying to figure out what people would want and need to learn across multiple sectors, many of them natural resource sectors. And one of the things that we discovered was that there was really no consensus on what the skills and knowledge and attributes were that people needed in order to do adaptation. This was inconsistent, and we really didn't have a reference to refer to. So we decided to build one, and that's what the competency framework is, and that's where it came from.
Right. And so why choose a competency framework?
Well, I in my background working in disaster management, I helped design a competency framework around the psychosocial response. And in some ways, that was a similar endeavor, which was we knew we needed it. There was no consistency around what people were asking for. And so we wanted to do that. And a competency framework really defines the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that are needed in order to take various actions. And in many ways to define what is effective performance or what is, sort of what is needed in a job role or an occupation. So a framework helps define a shared understanding of the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that we need, whether that's for training or building courses or credentialing or role and job performance. So it's essentially giving us that common language and some working towards some standardization about what we call climate adaptation work and the skills that are required for that.
Right. And so when we start to talk specifically about developing capacity for climate adaptation, what kinds of workers are we talking about? Who actually needs new skills?
My short answer is really everyone.
Yeah.
We know that successful, effective climate adaptation is going to touch on every sector, every organization in society. It really is a whole of society approach that we need. So it moves beyond simply training some of the professions that you might assume needed, and they do, so biologists or urban planners, to this whole of society approach, a more holistic undertaking. We know that, whether you're in transportation or municipal governments, federal, provincial governments, education, healthcare, technology sectors, every sector is going to have to consider how they adapt to the impacts, the unavoidable impacts of climate, and how they work towards reducing their carbon footprint to zero emissions. So in this endeavor, we are talking some scientific and technical knowledge, but it can't be reduced to that. We know that there's quite a spectrum of skills and knowledge that people are going to need to effectively manage and inspire change, to be able to work with a futures orientation in what they're doing. So here's the thing, the climate change doesn't just impact infrastructure. We often think about and need to be thinking about things like uh, dikes and foreshore, et cetera, but it ultimately affects people and societies. And that requires workers, employers to understand and develop new skills, new capacities, whether it's around finance or strategizing, change management, human resource, supply chains. All of these things are going to require our rethinking what we're doing. And, in some ways, it's a real opportunity to rethink and do things better.
Right. Excellent. And so here we are. So we've identified this massive urgent need for new adaptation capacity. So how is the new climate adaptation competency framework going to help us do that?
Well, it's one part in many parts. So, but it's really been designed. We've tried to design it as an easy to use concrete tool that supports organizations, institutions, individuals taking some first steps towards climate action, or if they're already engaged in climate action, taking the next steps by considering, what competencies, what strengths they have individually or within their team or organization, and where they may need to build new competencies. So really understanding what you have and where you may need some strengths. We built it with a number of core components. For those of you that have gone into the framework, you'll see that 24 competencies with some nod to assessment criteria, some sample role descriptions, and an implementation guide. We know that there's more to do in that regard, but there's really a solid foundation of both the definition of what the competencies are and how to work with those in a way to build your organization and build your capacity.
That's perfect. So let's take a closer look. And I mean, let's start with the kind of the main event, which are the competencies.
Yeah, okay. So there are 24 competencies organized into 5 domains, and you'll see those around that diagram. Climate adaptation science and practice literacy, climate adaptation leadership, working together, understanding the challenge, and planning and implementation. So these 5 domains and 24 competencies. So each domain has a range of 4 to 6 competencies, as you'll see. So a domain, and these, again, just sort of emphasizing that these aren't only technical and science skills, there are also other skills like understanding indigenous knowledge systems, or at least acknowledging that they exist and exploring ways to weave those in and acknowledge them in our work. Climate communication, assessing risk and vulnerability, designing adaptive solutions. So there's a broad range of competencies in those 5 domains. Each competency is then defined by knowledge, skills, and behaviors to help frame out what that competency is and help people assess whether they have it and how to get it.
Yeah, I have to say, when I first looked at the document, I thought it was just going to be basically a list of competencies. And I was actually quite blown away by what else is in this document. So to me, it actually feels a lot more like a toolkit than anything else, because, as we're realizing, it's not enough to just know what the competencies are. Leaders are going to need to know how to develop and manage and recruit and reward their workforce as they integrate those competencies. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, how we can use the framework to assess and reward competency acquisition.
Okay. So I agree, there's more to this than just understanding the competencies themselves, because obviously knowing something is great, but then you have to actually apply it and use it. So we provided a section with a proficiency scale. At this stage, it's a general proficiency scale, and there are 4 levels: awareness, basic, skilled, and expert. And these are sort of general ways of understanding a level of proficiency that can be applied to each of the competencies. It's at this point meant for communication more than performance evaluation. For it to shift into performance evaluation would take another layer of work where each of those proficiency scales is applied to each competency. But it gives a sense, and you can start thinking about a level of proficiency for every competency. And it really dovetails with the role descriptions that we've included in the toolkit as well.
Right. Okay. So tell us about the role descriptions. How does this work?
So we offered 2 kind of high level roles, climate adaptation generalists and contributing functional specialists. And those fancy names, but a generalist job, from our understanding, will focus primarily on climate adaptation. And that might be a consultant or somebody that's in an existing team, but that's their primary focus. Whereas the specialists will be adding adaptation in. They'll have a specific role, for an example, an engineer, a financial analyst, a planner, but they now need to integrate adaptation into that role and into their work. We've included role descriptions, high-level role descriptions for both. And the general kind of responsibilities, again, general for those. For example, a specialist role might be a risk manager or a physical asset manager, a policy planner, a municipal planner, health practitioner, environmental and civil engineers. So we've tried to offer some way of understanding and framing roles, and then how to connect those into the competencies that you're looking at. And so, of course, there's more to, building that climate adaptation dream team than just having the role descriptions. We also need to support it as much as we can in this document, a matrix to help people decide, where they need to hire and train, where they need to extend capacity. That matrix is included in the appendices if people are looking at the actual document. And this is a clip of it just to give you an idea of how to pull together competencies and proficiency scales and role descriptions to see what you have and where you need to grow. So in one sense, while the competencies I think are really important, this work in the matrix, et cetera, really kind of one of the most helpful parts, we hope, of the competency framework, as it starts helping people to understand how they can actually use it.
Right. And then the other thing that I was really surprised to see was this implementation guide at the back. It looks incredibly helpful. So what does it include?
Again, it's high level. So, one could get into a whole, 100-page manual with this stuff, but it's high level, and it outlines sort of 7 key steps to developing your workforce from our assessment, which includes things like assessing an individual or a team's competencies, identifying workforce gaps, and planning career development either through training or mentoring, etc. It also includes 9 ways to integrate climate adaptation competencies into human resource management. And we recognize that these kinds of competency frameworks are frequently used by human resource managers. It's not designed specifically for that, but we wanted to acknowledge that and look at the challenges for HR professionals and others for managing performance and recruiting, because that we believe is where this field is going to go, is that more and more jobs are already coming up and more jobs will need to include a consideration of adaptation and have a way of understanding whether an individual who's applying or fulfilling that role is actually bringing those skills and knowledge to the table.
Right. And that's a really great segue, because there's so many practical resources in here. I'm actually really excited to see how people can start to put it to work. So who do you see as the main users of the framework?
Well, I think it can be used to scale up any workforce. One of the biggest groups will probably likely be municipalities and regional governments, small towns and communities, because those really are the front line of adaptation now and into the future. They've got enormous responsibilities for everything from sustainable economic development and functioning to storm sewage maintenance and water use, etc. So we see those as certainly one of the large or sort of bodies of entities that will use them, but there will be many others. Some of the planning tools will be particularly important in those contexts to, again, sort of help people figure out what competencies they need and how best to get them, whether that's adding to a team or hiring consultants, etc. And then depending on the size of the organization, it'll likely mean getting creative, because we know one of the examples I said was, small towns and communities are likely not able to hire all the people they need. So it's going to be sort of forming alliances and building partnerships and understanding that the collaborative nature of the work that needs to be done in adaptation will involve many people, and people will need to either bring in a lot of skills around adaptation or skills specific to their profession to really weave that web of climate adaptation capacity in their organization.
Right. So that's a great use case for public sector. Who else are we talking about?
Well, I think again, businesses, business leaders, and some of the examples that we think are really important for competency frameworks are any business, but certainly large businesses who straddle both geographic jurisdictions and different functional operations in their organization. So if you think about large food producers and manufacturers like Heinz or Saputo or Maple Leaf here in Canada, they're growing, they're processing, they're packaging, they're shipping, they're engaging with retail, etc. So they have huge corporate operations with lots of employees and investments and infrastructure, and they need to adapt to climate change in consistent and standardized ways across their organization and across jurisdictions. So again, the competency framework can help them do that kind of recruiting and training and deployment, rewarding and retaining talent in a standardized way across multiple areas. And potentially, it's not like climate change is an opportunity, but there will be business opportunities in this context for rethinking how we do things. And as I said earlier, trying to do what we do better. So that's another use case. And then we also expect, I work in an educational institution, and we know that competency frameworks are increasingly becoming an expectation, a foundation for training and for credit programming. Higher education, professional associations, training groups, all those that are engaged in workforce development. So they'll be able to use it to inform learning outcomes and to design specific curricula to address gaps in workforce skill development for various industries and sectors. The educational institutions can use it to plan and manage and track within programs. This spring, we at Royal Roads are launching a new program in climate action leadership, a master's program in climate action leadership. So for example, the competencies that are outlined in this competency framework have informed both the program learning outcomes and with a deeper dive into courses to really shape a program that addresses many of those competencies that are outlined in the framework. You know.
Yeah, as you describe it more and more, I can see that it is going to be applicable for pretty much every single organization. Um, so we went out and we did a quick look to see what are some jobs that are actually out there right now. And when I was looking at, here's three just kind of local to BC. When I was looking at these, I could only imagine how much work went into figuring out exactly what knowledge and skills and behaviors were needed for each, because there really was no reference where people would be able to go and say, what does a manager generalist for climate change and sustainability services need? What do they need to do? So right now, all you can do is Google, and I can imagine that having a quick reference like the competency framework is really going to transform the way that we design and develop climate adaptation talent going forward. So
Mhm.
when I look back at what was involved in building the framework, it must have been a huge amount of work. Can you tell us a bit about how you did that?
Yeah, it was definitely more work than I or we anticipated at the beginning, and it's been a real learning curve in that regard. Um, in some ways, it's a logical extension of what we do and sort of the groundbreaking work we've been doing in the Resilience by Design Lab since its inception, which is really about capacity building, doing research and action research that's focused on understanding and really advancing leadership in climate action and disaster risk reduction and resilience, whether that's with young people or working professionals or various sectors. So it's a natural extension. So we started the research, and I want to give a shout out to Susanna Nieder, who's on the call. She was an instrumental part of the lab in terms of working on this piece of the competency framework and doing the desktop research that supported the design of the framework and the content. So we spent almost 2 years doing initial desktop research and then working with members of other Brace funded projects, including many of you who are here on the call, to really think about current and future roles and responsibilities. What do we mean by adaptation? What are the skills that we associate with adaptation? Susanna and I then interviewed over 25 climate adaptation subject matter experts and practitioners to get their thought on what are the competencies that are needed, where are the gaps, what do we need to do, what are the skill sets that are required. We had really an overwhelming response, and one of the surprises is just how much interest there has been and is in this framework. Um, it's been garnering a lot of attention, I think, just because it really is speaking to a current gap in this field that is emerging and growing even as we speak. So I think the depth of expertise that was in the Resilience by Design Lab, the depth of expertise in the community, the Brace community, and with other subject matter experts really informed this guide. And we also worked with a competency framework consultant, somebody who's steeped in this, and I know we'll be acknowledging them later, but I'll acknowledge Lynn Sikorsky now for helping us to really frame out how to make the framework a solid, coherent framework and move beyond just a constellation of competencies.
That's fantastic. And so I know as you went through and you did this work that the development of the framework actually revealed another critical need, which is a way to recognize and reward the development of climate adaptation competencies. So how are you addressing that?
Yes, well, this was part of the, ever expanding role of the framework. So, we took on way more research and we developed this framework and all the attendant pieces that we've already described. And as we've been doing that, it's become clear that the community, the larger community, in order to create some standardization, need some ways to help people build those skills in a coherent fashion. And so build and track the acquisition of competencies leads us quite clearly to micro credentials. So, if there's an employer in Moncton who's hiring somebody who's been trained in Kamloops for a job that happens in Toronto, you need to have some standardized way of saying, okay, we know they got them, not rather than them just saying it, and we can track this. So we've started working with BC Campus and the BC Ministry of Advanced Education, Skills and Training to develop a micro-credential pilot project that is focused on climate adaptation. the idea is, with micro credentials are these small credentials, whether you call it a badge or some other name, that are transferable and again consistent across jurisdictions, and that work in the same way as a recognized certificate or degree to signify proficiency in a specific competency or set of competencies. So we're just initiating that work right now, that we hope over the course of this year and next will result in not just only in BC, but across the country, the idea of these micro credentials that are linked to competencies, and whether those are linked to competencies as we have done in the Adaptation Learning Network courses that we're already offering, or as I said, in the MA in Climate Action Leadership, but with post-secondary partners across BC and more broadly. We know micro-credentials are becoming very popular. There's a lot of interest from federal and provincial governments in that, because again, there's a lot of emphasis right now in this COVID environment and in the context of climate change and the other challenges we're facing for building skills in a consistent way and developing workforce readiness to meet the climate challenge.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for this overview. I think you really kind of whet everybody's appetite for what's in the document. And I know we're going to have lots of questions and lots of discussion. So just before we do that, we wanted to give a big shout out. And so Robin, do you want to walk us through some thanks here?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we have funding from Natural Resources Canada, as I've mentioned, and the Ministry of Environment Climate Change Strategy. And obviously we wouldn't be able to have done this work without not only their funding, but their investment and support and sharing of expertise. So big shout out to them. I'd like to also give a shout out to Royal Roads, who's also not only supporting me in the Resilience by Design Lab, but also with in-kind investments supporting the project with their own investment and keen commitment to climate action, not only as part of this, but in other areas at the university, both in education that we deliver and currently a climate action task force that is developing a climate action leadership plan for the university.